Hello, my dear friends. They didn't just smell bad, they fermented. Clothes stuck to their bodies for weeks, lice nested in their hair, and the water they used, if any, was browner than the mud outside. But in the slums of Victorian London, filth wasn't a choice. It was routine. It was survival. Women cleaned themselves with crusty bread wrappers, wiped sweat with soot-blackened hands, and called it enough. What seemed disgusting to others was, for them, the closest thing to care. Tonight, you'll walk their narrow alleys and uncover how hygiene became a quiet act of desperation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If a woman in the slums of Victorian London wished to keep her mouth clean, she often had nothing but her own hands to rely on. The sight of a mother pressing her fingernail against the yellow film on her teeth was not unusual. Nails grew long not because of style, but because they became the cheapest tool to scrape away the layers that bread, tea, and smoke left behind. The rough edge of a nail could catch on hardened tartar, pulling small flakes away with every pass. But it left scratches that grew into tender sores. The taste was metallic, sometimes mixed with the faint sweetness of blood, and yet this was considered a kind of care. The alternative was to leave the teeth to rot entirely, which many did until the pain became unbearable. In crowded alleys where every penny went to bread or coal, the act of scraping teeth with bare nails counted as hygiene. Leaves were another substitute, gathered from hedges or sold in bundles at the cheapest stalls. Bitter leaves with astringent juices could give the impression of freshness. Women chewed them slowly until the texture softened, then rubbed the pulp against their gums afterward. The bitter mass was spat into a cloth that already bore stains from previous days. The cloth was never washed thoroughly, only shaken out, so the residue built up and hardened like crusts of old food. Still, the gesture created the illusion of cleansing. Mothers handed leaves to children, telling them to chew until the harsh taste numbed their tongues. Some children gagged but obeyed, because chewing was cheaper than buying even a small lump of soap. The appearance of teeth mattered less than the absence of pain. Yet blackened enamel became a sign of class as much as poverty. The poor smiled rarely, and when they did, the darkness of their mouths betrayed years of neglect. Noses wrinkled at the smell of infected gums. Lips split from the cold wind pulled tight against swollen tissue. Yet women persisted, scratching, chewing and spitting, because doing nothing felt worse. To stand in front of a bucket of water with no brush, no powder, and no soap was to feel helpless, at least with nails and leaves. There was the comfort of action. Inside one-room homes, the ritual became part of the daily routine. A woman might sit near the hearth, lift her veil or scarf, and bend over her lap while pressing a nail against her front teeth. Children stared while playing in the dirt, some copying the motion with tiny fingers. The sound was faint but grating, like chalk on stone. When a sieve of tartar broke free, it was dropped into the ashes by the fire. Families grew used to this sound, as ordinary as the scraping of a pot or the cracking of coal. It was not spoken of, but it was always there. The gums suffered most. Constant scratching made them bleed, and infection spread quickly. Swollen tissue pressed against loose teeth until they rocked with the motion of chewing. The taste of pus mingled with the bitterness of leaves. But women endured it. They believed cleanliness had a price, and the price was pain. To scrape until blood flowed was a proof of effort. Neighbours saw it not as strange but as determined. It almost feels absurd to imagine someone congratulating herself for bleeding gums. Yet in that world, it was the only sign that something had been done. If we compare this to today, the difference is staggering. Modern markets sell rows of brushes and pastes, each promising health, beauty, and whiteness, Even the cheapest brands are safe and effective, and dentists are within reach for many. In contrast, those Victorian women fought with bare nails against decay, and the result was mouths filled with suffering. It is like imagining a family using broken glass to clean dishes because a sponge was too expensive. The gap between then and now is not only in comfort, but in dignity. The wider environment deepened the problem. Smoke from coal settled on everything, leaving soot inside the mouth as well as on skin and clothing. Food was coarse and often mixed with grit from grinding stones, adding to the wear on enamel. Water was scarce and unsafe, so rinsing was rare. What little water was saved went to cooking, not to mouths. Teeth bore the scars of this life, cracking and darkening before women reached middle age. Some lost teeth entirely and simply chewed with their gums until the end of their lives. Reports from reformers occasionally mentioned oral health among the poor, but they were drowned out by louder concerns such as cholera or factory injuries. Teeth did not kill as quickly as poisoned wells or collapsing buildings, so they were ignored. Women themselves rarely complained, for complaints changed nothing. Instead, they passed down their makeshift practices, teaching daughters how to scrape, chew, and spit, repeating the cycle until it became tradition. Within the dim rooms of London's poorest districts, the smell of sickness lingered. Still, women tried to resist complete surrender. They reached for nails, they reached for leaves, they did what they could. The effort may not have saved their teeth, but it gave them a sense of holding on. However fragile, I cannot help but think that this stubbornness, though painful, carried a strange dignity in lives where so much was already taken away. They scraped their teeth with nails and chewed bitter leaves, trying to hold on to an idea of cleanliness that was always out of reach. Yet even these painful efforts could not solve the most intimate problems of daily life. What they used in place of cloth for their bodies may leave you unsettled. Women in the slums of Victorian London often reached for whatever fabric lay within their homes when their bodies demanded care. A tablecloth frayed at the edges, or a shirt worn until it thinned, became more than clothing or household linen. Torn strips served as makeshift cloths to wipe themselves. Though these were never fresh, they carried stains from previous use, and the smell of mildew rose as soon as they were handled. In one corner of a single room, a woman might bend awkwardly to wipe herself with fabric that still bore the marks of meals eaten or soot that had settled during the night. It was not a choice but an act of necessity. When no water flowed and no clean rags could be bought, their own garments had to serve. The practice carried pain, fabric not meant for tender flesh scraped against the skin. Threads coarse from repeated washing in dirty water grew stiff and sharp. Each time they pressed the cloth, irritation flared. What began as stinging soon settled into a steady itch that never truly left. Women spoke little of this discomfort, but it followed them throughout the day, shaping how they walked, how they sat, how they slept. The body adapted by accepting the sting as normal. This transformation of pain into habit was the only way survival could continue. These clothes were used again and again. Water was too scarce for washing, and soap was a luxury reserved for laundry that had to be shown in public. Cloth stained in private were shaken out, folded, and tucked under bedding until needed again. Bacteria thrived in the damp fibres, though no one had the means to name it. The smell told the truth, but smell was a companion in every aspect of life. Women grew used to it, as they grew used to smoke, sewage, and rot. To them, the odour was not a warning but a reminder of reality. It's almost grimly comic to think of a woman carefully folding a filthy rag as if it were precious silk, but such care was all she could afford. The act left its mark not only on bodies but on minds. To grow up watching mothers tear a sleeve or a hem and press it between their legs taught daughters what to expect. Young girls, upon reaching maturity, repeated the gestures with resignation. No one explained, no one instructed formally, yet the sight of cloth being cut from garments was lesson enough. Over time, what began as improvisation hardened into tradition. Comparisons to the modern world make the contrast clear. Today, shelves in every store display products designed for comfort, cleanliness, and discretion. Materials soft as cotton clouds, infused with scents or sealed in sterile packages, are taken for granted. For Victorian women in the slums, the opposite was true. Their bodies were forced to accept rough fibres, unwashed fabric, and constant irritation. It's like imagining someone in our time using sandpaper for personal care simply because nothing else was available. The gulf between then and now reveals how much suffering was bound to poverty. Inside the crowded rooms of London's poorest neighbourhoods, privacy did not exist. Women crouched in corners, sometimes beside cooking pots or near beds crowded with children. They tried to conceal the clothes, not from shame but to protect them from being stolen or repurposed. Every scrap of fabric held value. To waste one was unthinkable. Some clothes bore the faded patterns of flowers, now blurred by stains. Others were plain brown or grey, indistinguishable from rags used to wipe furniture or floorboards. That blurring of purpose reflected the blurred lines between survival and hygiene. Infections were common, redness spread across the skin, rubbed raw, ulcers formed, and scratching brought small wounds that never healed cleanly. Medical help was rare and often useless. Doctors dismissed women's discomfort as trivial, attributing illness to weakness of character rather than the obvious cause. The women themselves bore the pain quietly. Complaining risked nothing but humiliation. Their silence added another layer of invisibility to their struggles. I find it haunting to picture this silence, as if the absence of words could lessen the weight of the suffering itself. This form of hygiene revealed the cruel paradox of poverty. The same society that filled parlours with perfumes and lace allowed its poorest women to rub their bodies raw with old tablecloths. Respectability was preached from pulpits, yet in alleys, women fought daily against filth with the very clothes meant to cover them. Appearances mattered, but only for those who could afford them. For everyone else, the boundary between dress and dirt dissolved. Over time, the body adjusted in terrible ways. The stinging lessened as nerves dulled. Itching became background noise in lives already filled with noise from factories, markets, and crying children. Women grew older, with skin marked by rashes and scars. Yet they rarely spoke of longing for comfort. The imagination of comfort itself shrank until the act of wiping with fabric seemed natural. What shocked outsiders barely registered within the slums. They wiped with rags torn from tablecloths and shirts, folded and reused until they stiffened with filth. The pain became part of life, absorbed into routine. Yet the reality of reuse extended even further into practices that blurred the boundary between kitchen and body. What women hung out to dry alongside their food might unsettle you. Women in the poorest streets of Victorian London often found themselves without any space set aside for privacy. Laundry lines stretched from window to window, sometimes across alleys, sometimes through small courtyards where food was also prepared. On those same ropes, the same wooden poles, and the same hooks, women hung the cloths they had used on their bodies. These clothes were stained with blood, darkened by repeated use, and stiff from not being washed properly. Yet they dangled in the open air beside aprons, cooking towels, and even bunches of herbs meant for meals. There was no distinction between what touched the body, what touched the kitchen, and what touched the mouths of children. The mingling of these things became ordinary, as though the mixture of domestic tasks erased the difference between clean and unclean. The smell betrayed them. Blood soaked into fabric left a heavy odour, one that clung even after days of hanging. Damp London air kept the cloths from ever drying fully, and mildew crept through the fibres, leaving green patches that spread like bruises. When the wind shifted, the smell rolled across alleys, sour and unmistakable. Neighbours noticed. Yet no one commented directly. To speak of it would have been to admit knowledge. And in these communities, silence protected dignity. Women exchanged glances but rarely words. Children wrinkled their noses, but learned quickly to keep questions unspoken. Inside cramped homes, there was no space to hide these clothes. Baskets overflowed with laundry, and dirty rags blended with the rest. To throw one away was unthinkable. Every piece of fabric had value. Even when stained beyond recognition, some women rinsed them lightly in buckets of grey water saved from cooking, but the water carried grease and dirt of its own. After rinsing, they hung the rags outside with the rest. The stains never disappeared. They only grew darker with each cycle of use, each attempt at cleaning. It almost feels like a cruel joke that cloth meant for hygiene could end up dirtier than the rags used to scrub soot from walls. The children learned early to avert their eyes. Mothers did not explain. Fathers pretended not to notice. And siblings played beneath the swaying lines of fabric without asking questions. By the age of 10, many goth girls already knew from observation what those clothes meant. Knowledge was absorbed silently, and secrecy became part of education. The avoidance of words built a barrier thicker than stone. Comparisons to modern practices highlight the absurdity. Today, hygiene products are sold in packages sealed to prevent even a trace of contamination. Disposal is simple, discreet, and hidden from sight. In Victorian slums, the opposite was true. Stained rags waved in the open air where food dried and clothing aired out. It is like imagining someone hanging surgical waste on the same line as baby clothes in a modern backyard. What would horrify us now was once an unquestioned part of survival. Markets reflected this casual mixture of life and decay. Buyers touched fish, then cloth, then food without washing their hands. Vendors wrapped bread in the same paper used to wipe counters. This blurred world extended naturally to the laundry lines. The division between food, filth, and flesh simply did not exist in the way it does today. That division required resources and space, luxuries the poor could not claim, and the consequences were harsh. Infections spread through families who handled the same clothes for multiple purposes. The dampness carried mold spores that irritated lungs already scarred by coal smoke. Cuts and scratches on children's hands grew inflamed when they touched rags left within reach. Women themselves bore sores and rashes that lingered for weeks, made worse by the constant reapplication of dirty cloth. Doctors ignored such conditions, dismissing them as ordinary complaints of the poor. Women endured them, not because they chose to, but because they had no other option. Within these neighbourhoods, the sight of blood-stained cloth fluttering beside food was no cause for alarm. It became part of the scenery. Reformers who visited described the stench and the spectacle with horror, yet residents themselves scarcely reacted. To them, the line between private suffering and public display no longer existed. Hanging the cloth outside was less about hygiene than about necessity. Indoors, the air was too heavy, too damp, too filled with smoke from coal fires. Only outside could fabric dry even a little, and outside meant everyone saw. This visibility carried shame that was both heavy and muted. Women turned their faces away from their own rags, hoping no one noticed, though everyone did. The community's agreement to look without seeing gave a fragile protection. Children were scolded not for touching but for noticing. The lesson was clear: what hangs in the line must not be spoken of. This unspoken rule preserved dignity in a world that offered little of it. I cannot help but think of how crushing it must have been to live with such silence, where even the smallest detail of bodily life became a public burden. Some women tried to disguise the clothes by hanging them inside folds of larger garments or hiding them among darker fabrics, but the smell betrayed them regardless. Others gave up on hiding, accepting the exposure as part of their daily existence. The tension between concealment and acceptance mirrored the larger contradictions of life in the slums. Poverty made everything visible, yet denied the right to speak of what was seen. The act of drying clothes in public reveals more than a lack of hygiene. It shows how communities normalize what should have been intolerable. It demonstrates the way necessity reshaped values until the shocking became mundane. The lines between survival and shame blurred as completely as the stains on the fabric. They hung their bloodied rags on ropes beside herbs and aprons, leaving them to wave in the wind and spread their odour through the alleys. The stains never vanished, only deepened with time, while silence kept the practice unquestioned. But sometimes silence was broken by choices more desperate, where women abandoned the effort to stop the flow at all. Bloodstains on the floors of slum homes in Victorian London were not always accidents. In some cases, they were the result of deliberate choice, for women who had no rags left to use, no water to clean, and no strength to keep reusing cloth stiff with filth. The simplest answer was to stop trying altogether. They allowed the blood to flow freely, soaking their garments and dripping onto the boards beneath them. This was not carelessness, but exhaustion, born from days when survival demanded prioritizing bread over fabric. In rooms where children shared straw bedding with parents, the stains appeared and deepened, yet no one spoke of them. The silence was not ignorance, but resignation. The cost of cloth was always measured against food. A strip of clean fabric might mean fewer coins for bread or coal. Faced with such choices, women sometimes chose to sacrifice dignity rather than meals. The result was a body left unattended, carrying the burden openly. Garments became stiff and heavy, clinging to the skin until they rubbed sores into the thighs. Every movement reminded them of what they had chosen, but it was still less painful than the thought of hunger in their children's stomachs. It sounds almost absurd to imagine valuing a loaf of bread above personal hygiene, yet in that world, such calculations were unavoidable. The rooms themselves bore witness. Dark patches formed on wooden floors where liquid seeped and dried. Straw mats absorbed what they could, releasing sour smells when shifted. Furniture carried marks that no scrubbing could erase. Though little scrubbing was done in the first place, visitors noticed but turned their eyes away. Neighbours who passed through recognised the stains for what they were but pretended otherwise. To acknowledge them would be to confront the depth of poverty they all shared. Silence became the only form of protection left. The health consequences were severe. Skin was inflamed where the fabric pressed against it. The constant moisture encouraged infections that spread quickly. Some women grew feverish, their bodies overwhelmed by wounds that never healed. Without proper treatment, many wasted away slowly, others collapsed suddenly, their weakened state unable to endure another cycle. Children watched their mothers weaken, associating the smell of iron and mildew with ordinary life. Death was not always linked to disease or accident. Sometimes it came from neglect forced by necessity. Modern comparison underlines the cruelty. Today, supplies for such needs are produced in endless variety, designed for comfort, safety, and discretion. To imagine leaving the body untreated for days, allowing stains to mark furniture and clothing, seems unthinkable. It would be like picturing someone in our time choosing to bleed openly in an office, because buying supplies meant skipping dinner. What horrifies now was once woven into the fabric of survival. The mental burden was as heavy as the physical. Women lived with the knowledge that every step left a trace, that every seat carried a mark. Shame gnawed at them. Though they buried it beneath routine, the more visible the stains became, the less anyone seemed willing to admit their presence. Families carried on as if nothing was wrong. Children were taught not to ask, not to notice, not to question. The silence was thicker than the smell. In slum alleys, blood trails sometimes stretched from doors to outdoor privies. These traces shocked outsiders but barely registered among residents. To them, the stains were just another mark on streets already fouled by sewage and waste. The boundaries between private suffering and public exposure blurred entirely. In a city that prided itself on order and morality, such realities were hidden in plain sight, ignored by those who had the means to change them. I find it chilling to imagine such visibility paired with such indifference, as though human suffering had become wallpaper no one cared to strip away. This acceptance reflected more than poverty. It revealed how society valued the lives of the poor. Authorities condemned drunkenness, idleness and immorality, but they turned a blind eye to the everyday indignities that ground women down. A loaf of bread could cost less than a strip of cloth. Yet no charity intervened to provide one. The expectation was that the poor would manage on their own, no matter how impossible the task. The result was bodies neglected to the point of collapse, normalized by those forced to live that way. Inside these households, coping strategies varied. Some women layered old skirts to absorb what they could, though this left them heavier and more uncomfortable. Others sat for long hours to minimize movement, hoping stillness would reduce the spread of stains. Some scrubbed at garments with cold water and bare hands, though the stains never lifted fully. Each method brought its own humiliation. None resolved the underlying absence of resources. Community knowledge carried its own cruel logic. Daughters learned early that fabric was precious. They understood that bleeding onto the floor could sometimes be more acceptable than wasting cloth. By adolescence, they absorbed the unspoken rule that survival always outweighed comfort. Habits formed in childhood are carried into adulthood, binding generations to the same cycle of neglect. Observers from wealthier districts occasionally reported on the conditions they witnessed. Articles spoke of filth, odours, and shocking practices, yet little was done beyond printing words of outrage. Reform came slowly, and even when proposed, it rarely reached the women most in need. The persistence of these practices testified to the strength of poverty's grip, stronger than any reformer's pen. They let the blood flow, staining floors, mats, and garments, because rags were too precious to waste. Marks spread through homes, and yet eyes turned away, preserving silence where words might have brought shame. But the choice to surrender hygiene altogether was not the final extreme, for there were other desperate measures to combat the pests that thrived in this same environment. Ash from the hearth became more than a byproduct of cooking in the crowded homes of Victorian slums. When fires burned through the night and pots of porridge or stew were taken away, the residue left at the bottom of stoves and grates collected into soft piles. Women scooped these ashes into their palms and rubbed them against their skin, pressing the grey dust into their hands, necks, and chests. It was their version of a dry bath, a ritual born of scarcity. Water was too precious, soap even rarer, and privacy almost impossible. Ash offered the illusion of cleansing. By coating themselves in powder, they believed they were scrubbing away the odours of sweat and dirt, leaving something closer to freshness behind. The texture was harsh, fine at first. The ash quickly clumped with oil from the skin, turning into a paste that smeared rather than cleaned. As it dried, it formed dark streaks that gave the skin the look of being sun-touched, though the tone was uneven and rough. Women tolerated the sting as they rubbed, convinced that the sharpness meant it was working. Each session left their eyes watering, irritated by the drifting particles that clung to lashes and burned when inhaled. Yet the practice continued day after day, handed down across generations as though it were knowledge worth preserving. The smell mixed oddly with daily life. Ash carried the aroma of the fuel it came from coal, wood, or scraps burned to keep fires alive. On some days, it smelled of resin or pine, on others of rancid grease that had spilled into flames. These scents clung to bodies after rubbing, layering atop natural sweat until the air in a room grew thick. Still, women considered themselves cleaner for having done it. It is strangely comical to picture someone proudly calling themselves refreshed while covered in soot. But this was the reality of slum hygiene. Children grew up watching the process, sometimes asked to hold bowls of ash while their mothers rubbed. They mimicked the motions, pressing dust into their own arms. The sting of irritation taught them quickly that cleanliness carried pain. When asked why they endured it, mothers might gesture toward the smell of smoke already filling the home. If everything smelled of coal, they reasoned, then bodies dusted with ash at least blended into the background. Modern standards make the contrast stark. Today, even the poorest households in industrialized nations usually have access to soap and clean water. Entire aisles in shops are filled with products designed for comfort and softness, promising smooth skin and pleasant scents. In the slums of Victorian London, however, ash was the cosmetic, the cleanser, and the deodorant. It would be like someone in our time pouring the contents of a vacuum cleaner bag over themselves and calling it a shower. The idea is shocking now, but then it was common sense. The physical toll was severe, skin broke out in rashes from constant abrasion. Pores clogged with ash hardened into small bumps that itched and flared red. Some women scratched until they bled, creating sores that healed poorly in unsanitary environments. Eyes remained inflamed, and coughing fits often followed long sessions of rubbing. Doctors rarely acknowledged these problems, dismissing them as minor irritations rather than recognizing them as consequences of desperate hygiene. The women themselves bore the discomfort silently, considering it preferable to being thought dirty. The ritual itself became part of daily rhythms. After meals were cooked and pots cleared, ashes were saved in small containers or swept into piles. Women knelt near the hearth, dipping their hands and working the dust across their skin with a determination that almost resembled pride. To leave the house without performing this routine felt shameful, even if the results were visibly uneven. Ash became a badge of effort, proof that they had not neglected themselves completely. Within the crowded courtyards and alleys, the sight was common enough to escape notice. Bodies streaked with grey did not stand out in neighbourhoods where soot-blackened walls and smoke drifted constantly. In fact, blending into the dirt may have offered a form of protection. To appear too clean might draw ridicule or suspicion, while to appear dirty invited judgment. Dusting with ash placed women in the ambiguous middle, neither too polished nor too neglected. I cannot help but think how heavy it must have felt to live in a world where even the act of appearing normal required covering oneself in filth. The symbolism of ash went deeper than anyone admitted. It marked poverty in ways words could not. Every streak, every stain, every cough that followed a cleansing told the story of limited choices. Reformers who visited slum neighbourhoods wrote of the smell and the odd rituals they saw, yet rarely offered solutions. Instead, they framed these practices as evidence of moral weakness, rather than the logical outcome of deprivation. Women bore the judgment alongside the irritation, caught between necessity and shame. Some tried alternatives. Sand from riverbanks, when available, could scrub skin more harshly, though it cut more than it cleaned. Scraps of cloth dipped in cold water might wipe away a layer of grime, but water carried risks of its own, often polluted with disease. Compared to these, ash seemed safer, even if the effects were far from gentle. The choice was not between good and bad, but between bad and worse. At night, as families gathered near fires for warmth, bowls of ash sat quietly nearby, waiting for morning routines. In the flickering light, the powder seemed harmless, even comforting. By dawn, it became the tool of cleansing again, repeated without question. This cycle stretched across years, carving itself into the rhythm of life in the slums. They rubbed ash across their bodies, stinging their eyes and scratching their skin, convinced that it gave them a kind of cleanliness. The residue marked them with streaks and odours, but the ritual carried on as if it were salvation. Yet even in these homes, objects meant for care could gain unexpected meaning, treasured far beyond their worth in the wider world. Combs in the slums of Victorian London were not ordinary objects. A single wooden comb, chipped and cracked, could pass through the hands of several generations, treasured as if it were jewellery. Families guarded them carefully, placing them on shelves beside bread or sewing tools, knowing full well that replacing one would be nearly impossible. Even when teeth snapped off and gaps appeared, the comb was never thrown away. Instead, women pushed thin sticks or splinters of bamboo into the empty spaces to create new teeth. The makeshift repairs looked awkward, but the comb continued to serve its purpose. This object, fragile and patched, became more than a tool for grooming. It was a measure of survival, proof that something could endure in a world where so much broke down. Daily routines revolved around such combs. At dawn, mothers sat near the small light of a fire, drawing the teeth of the comb through their tangled hair. Children watched, sometimes impatiently waiting for their turn, sometimes squirming as the comb caught in knots. The sound was harsh, the scrape of wood dragging through strands thick with dust and oil. Each pull collected hair, dandruff, and the residue of smoke that filled the air. Rather than cleaning the comb, women saw the accumulation as evidence of resilience. It almost seems darkly humorous to think of every lost hair stuck in the teeth as a family record. Yet that is exactly how they valued it. The comb served more than hygiene. It was a sign of care, a symbol that someone had not given up on appearance entirely in neighbourhoods where water was scarce and soap unaffordable. Hair often went unwashed for months. Running a comb through it gave the illusion of order, taming strands into neat lines even if they remained greasy. Mothers combed their daughters before sending them to work in factories, believing the act made them presentable. Fathers, too, occasionally borrowed the comb to smooth their hair before seeking day labour. The object belonged to everyone, passed from hand to hand, without concern for cleanliness. Modern comparisons make this practice striking. Today, combs are cheap and disposable, found in stores in every colour and shape. When one breaks, it is thrown away without thought. In Victorian slums, however, a comb was irreplaceable. It is like imagining an entire family today sharing a single toothbrush, carefully repairing it with twigs whenever bristles fall out. What would horrify us now was common then, and it carried a logic rooted in scarcity. The comb carried risks, shared use spread lice quickly, and the wooden teeth, already cracked, sometimes broke into the scalp and caused small wounds. These cuts festered in unwashed hair, turning into sores that lingered for weeks, yet no one considered abandoning the comb. The alternative was to let hair grow wild, a mark of neglect that carried social judgment. In the hierarchy of the poor, even small gestures of grooming mattered. Every family treated their comb differently. Some polished it with oil to keep the wood from splintering. Others wrapped it in scraps of cloth when not in use. Some kept it in boxes alongside sewing needles and coins. Children were often scolded for dropping or misplacing it. For to lose the comb was to lose a piece of the family's security. Repairs became part of its story, and the patched appearance gave it character. Each new tooth inserted, each crack glued together, represented another season survived. The emotional weight of the comb was immense. Mothers spoke of it as though it were a companion. Remembering when it had been passed down from their own mothers, it represented continuity in a life marked by instability. In times when food ran out and landlords threatened eviction, the comb was one of the few possessions that could be relied on to remain. Its survival gave women comfort, as though they were not entirely adrift. I cannot help but think how powerful it must have felt to hold such a fragile object and yet believe it was proof of endurance. The act of combing became ritualistic. At night, after long days of work, families gathered by dim lamps or fires. Hair was undone and combed slowly, one section at a time. Children drifted to sleep listening to the scraping sound. The rhythm was both soothing and painful, tugging at tangles until tears formed, but it was endured as part of life. The comb drew families together, uniting them in a shared gesture that was as much about survival as about grooming. Reformers who entered slum neighbourhoods occasionally commented on these combs. They were shocked at their condition, at how something so worn could still be cherished. Yet for residents, the comb's value lay not in appearance but in utility. It proved that even in scarcity, something could last. In a world where boots wore thin within months and clothing frayed until it fell apart, the comb was almost eternal. Over time, the teeth collected layers of residue, thick enough to form ridges between strands of hair. Some women scraped it off with knives, only to have it build again within days. The accumulation was never fully removed, and eventually it hardened into permanent crusts. Instead of disgust, families saw this as proof of age. The comb's condition testified to years of use, to hands that had held it, to struggles endured. They clung to combs patched with twigs and splintered wood. passing them from mothers to daughters, fathers to sons, until they became heirlooms of poverty. Each hair caught in the teeth was not filth but history, a record of survival. Yet even as they combed, scratching sores into their scalps, another nightly ritual plagued their lives, one that denied them sleep and left scars of its own. Nights in the slums of Victorian London were never quiet, and they were rarely restful. Darkness did not bring peace, but revealed another misery that thrived in the crowded rooms. Lice, living in hair and burrowed into clothing seams, crawled across scalps and necks long after the fires in the hearth had gone cold. Women lay awake, scratching until their nails tore the skin, desperate for a relief that never lasted. The constant itching became part of the soundscape of the night. Alongside coughing children and creaking floorboards, sleep, already fragile, was stolen completely by the crawling presence of pests. The sensation was unbearable. Each movement of a louse felt magnified in the silence, and the irritation spread across the scalp like fire. Women dug their fingers deep, raking across the skin until blood appeared beneath their nails. Relief came for a moment, then faded as the insects continued. The cycle repeated endlessly. By morning, pillows and straw bedding were streaked with spots of blood, and the skin of the neck was covered in scratches. Yet this was not a rare event, but a nightly battle, repeated without fail. It is almost bitterly funny to think of lice as bedtime companions, but in the slums, they were more reliable than rest. The infestation never remained personal. Families shared beds, with children, mothers, and sometimes older relatives lying side by side. Once lice appeared on one head, they spread to every other. Infants woke crying, scratching their tiny necks. Mothers-in-law complained of burning skin, yet endured it in silence, unwilling to shame the household. Sisters whispered their discomfort through gestures, scratching at collars during the day. Eyes heavy from lack of sleep, no one escaped. The pests travelled from hair to hair, clothing to clothing, until the entire household bore the same torment. Attempts at control were desperate and crude. Some women boiled their combs in dirty water, hoping to kill what clung between the teeth. Others rubbed vinegar or kerosene onto their hair, enduring the sting and the foul smell, only to see the insects return within days. Fire was the most extreme measure. A lock of hair cut away was sometimes thrown into flames, the burning smell filling the room, while women watched in frustration, knowing it was a small victory in a larger war. These remedies never lasted. The conditions of the slums, crowding, dirt, and constant contact ensured lice always came back. Compared with modern standards, the difference is staggering. Today, shampoos and treatments eliminate infestations quickly, often within days, and bedding can be washed in machines with hot water. In Victorian London's slums, there was no such luxury. It is like imagining a family today trying to clean their entire home of pests with nothing but their fingernails and a bucket of ash. What is a minor inconvenience now was then an inescapable part of existence. The smell was another torment. Lice left a sour odour that clung to bedding and hair, mixed with sweat and the iron tang of blood from scratching. This smell lingered in every corner of the home. Families grew used to it, though visitors recoiled in alleys and markets. People recognised it instantly, a sign that someone lived in the poorest quarters. Women carried the shame silently, knowing that even when they combed their hair neatly, the odour betrayed them. Children bore scars from the nightly battles. Their scalps grew thick with sores, and their nails broke from constant scratching. Teachers in the few schools that admitted poor children noticed the marks, but instead of sympathy, they often scolded or mocked. Lice were seen as proof of laziness rather than poverty. Mothers wept quietly at such accusations, knowing how many nights they had fought beside their children, combing through hair by candlelight, trying to find relief. Their efforts were invisible, their failures undeniable. I cannot help but feel sorrow when imagining a woman judged for filth while she sat awake night after night, tearing her own scalp raw in futile resistance. The broader community accepted lice as part of life. Women gathered outside to pick at each other's hair, searching for the insects under dim light. Became a communal act, almost ritualistic, as though solidarity softened the humiliation. Yet even in groups, the pests resisted every effort. The insects returned with relentless certainty, undoing hours of searching and cleaning in a single night. The toll on mental health was heavy. Sleep deprivation compounded exhaustion from long hours of labour. Women stumbled through days in factories or markets, their eyes red, their bodies weakened. The constant itching made concentration impossible. Anger flared easily. Quarrels sparked over small things, and patience with children wore thin. The insects were not only parasites of the body but also of the mind, eating away at peace and endurance. Some reformers wrote of lice in their reports, describing the misery in detail, yet their words rarely translated into aids. Instead, they became further evidence used to portray the poor as degraded. The true cause, overcrowding, lack of sanitation, and absence of resources, was rarely addressed. Blame fell on the women themselves, as though they invited the pests into their homes. Society preferred to condemn rather than to understand, and yet, within the slums, life carried on. Women tied scarves around their heads to hide the sores, brushed their hair with the same patched combs, and tucked children into straw bedding still crawling with movement. They endured because there was no alternative. The silence of the night, filled with scratching, became as natural as the sound of rats in the walls or carts rolling through streets. They lay awake, scratching until blood came, sharing the torment across generations and breathing in the sour odour of infestation. Rest was denied, replaced by endless irritation that consumed the night. But some chose a more drastic solution, one that brought fire into their homes in the hope of driving pests away. Hair in the slums of Victorian London was not simply a matter of appearance. It became a battlefield, one where women fought endlessly against lice that would not leave their scalps in peace. When scratching, combing, and vinegar failed, some turned to fire. In rooms already filled with the smell of coal and damp wood, the decision was made to cut away chunks of hair and burn them. Flames licked at strands thrown into small metal basins, filling the air with smoke and the acrid stench of singed flesh. To outsiders, it may have seemed extreme, but to those who endured night after night of torment, it felt like the only defence left. The ritual was harsh. A woman sat on the floor, scissors or a kitchen knife in her hands, and hacked at her hair in uneven sections. Locks tumbled into her lap, sticky with sweat and crawling with insects. She gathered them with trembling fingers, dropped them into a tin bowl, and struck a match. The fire burned quickly, turning the strands into curled ashes that drifted upward with the smell of burning horn. The sound was faint but unforgettable, a crackle that seemed to echo the breaking of dignity. Children cried at the sight, disturbed not only by the flames but by the fear that their mother's hair, a symbol of beauty and pride, was being destroyed before their eyes. It is almost grimly absurd to picture lice being treated as enemies worthy of fire. Yet, for these women, the comparison felt accurate. The smoke carried through the alleys. Neighbours smelled it immediately. The scent distinct from coal or wood. They knew what it meant. Some nodded in silent understanding. Others shook their heads, but few judged. The community accepted such actions because the misery of lice was universal. Better to lose hair and endure smoke than to keep suffering in silence. The smell clung to walls, drifted into bedding and lingered on clothing and lingered on. Even days later, the memory of the burning remained, a reminder of the battle fought inside. The loss of hair left its own scars. Women walked the streets with uneven tufts, patches of scalp visible beneath thinning strands. They tried to cover themselves with shawls or scarves, but the damage showed. Hair had been a source of pride, even among the poor, and its destruction carried shame. Yet the absence of lice brought relief, however brief. The scalp could rest, wounds could heal, and for a few nights, sleep was possible. This fragile peace rarely lasted. as lice returned quickly from neighbours or children, but those short intervals of comfort were treasured. Modern comparisons sharpen the cruelty of this choice. Today, lice can be treated with shampoos, lotions, and specialised combs. Hair can be preserved, dignity maintained, and relief achieved without pain. It would be like imagining someone today setting fire to their mattress in order to get rid of fleas, because no sprays or treatments were affordable. The thought shocks us now, yet for Victorian women, the logic was undeniable. Fire was free and hair could grow back. The process sometimes went further. Desperate women pressed burning strands near their scalps, trying to kill lice still clinging to the roots. This brought blistering burns and permanent scars. Some lost entire sections of hair to fire accidents, left with bald patches that never grew back, yet they spoke little of it, hiding beneath caps or kerchiefs, presenting a calm face to the world while their skin throbbed beneath the fabric. The cost of shame felt smaller than the torment of infestation. Children absorbed these lessons silently. Daughters watched their mothers cut and burn, learning that beauty could be sacrificed for survival. Boys, too, recognized the smell of burning hair as part of home life, associating it with evenings when smoke filled the single-room dwellings. For them, lice were not pests to be eradicated by medicine, but enemies requiring sacrifice. These memories stayed with them, shaping how they understood poverty and resilience. The wider community sometimes mocked. Reformers visiting the slums wrote of women mutilating their hair in desperate attempts to fight lice, painting it as a symbol of ignorance. They failed to see the logic behind the act. It was not ignorance, but a cruel calculation hair could return, but sleep once lost could break a person completely. Authorities ignored the underlying causes, overcrowding, lack of sanitation, and absence of clean clothing. Choosing instead to moralize, once again, women bore the weight of judgment without support. I cannot help but feel a heavy respect for these women, who endured humiliation and pain yet still chose action over surrender. The aftermath was always visible. Ash from burned hair settled in the corners of rooms, swept away only when it became too thick to ignore. Scarves smelled of smoke for days. Children coughed when inhaling the fumes, adding another layer of discomfort to already unhealthy environments. Yet even with these side effects, women repeated the process when infestations grew unbearable again. The cycle of cutting and burning became part of the rhythm of slum life, just as much as cooking or cleaning. For those who lived nearby, the smell was unmistakable. Passing through alleys, one could tell immediately when someone had chosen fire. The burnt odour announced the battle fought indoors, carrying with it the silent acknowledgement of shared misery. Neighbours rarely spoke of it, for to comment would be to expose their own struggles. Instead, they allowed the smoke to pass through the air as another sign of poverty, accepted but never questioned. In the end, burning hair was not about vanity or even hygiene. It was about reclaiming a fragment of control in lives stripped of choice, against lice that tormented them without pause. Women fought with the only weapon they had. Fire became their answer. Even if it scarred them, even if it shamed them, for a few moments of peace, the price was worth paying. They cut their hair, set it aflame in basins, and filled their homes with the smell of charred strands, believing it was the only way to escape the crawling misery. Relief was fleeting. Shame was lasting. But the choice revealed the depth of desperation in the slums, and yet, fire was not the only strange substitute for proper hygiene, for even water itself was replaced with things far less pure. Water in the slums of Victorian London was never taken for granted. In homes where taps did not exist and wells were fouled by waste, women looked for a liquid wherever they could find it. One unlikely source was the basins of water left behind in taverns, street kitchens, and small eating houses. After dishes were scrubbed, the grey, greasy liquid was poured away into barrels or tossed into gutters. Women sometimes begged or quietly collected this used water, carrying it back to their homes in buckets or jars. Though clouded with food scraps and thick with grease, It offered what they needed most, something wet to wipe their bodies with. The process began with filtering. A rag or worn cloth was stretched over the mouth of a bowl, and the dirty water was poured slowly. Larger scraps of cabbage, turnip skins, or bones remained on the fabric while the liquid seeped through. What passed into the bowl was still far from clean, but it was thinner, easier to scoop up with another cloth. Women dipped fabric into the grey water and rubbed it across their arms, necks, and faces. The sensation was not refreshing but sticky, as though oil was spreading rather than being removed. Yet this ritual gave them a sense of cleansing. It was a substitute for the baths they could never afford. The smell clung tightly. Dishwater carried the scent of stewed meat, old beer, and sour grease. Soap was sometimes present, but in such small amounts that it only added a faint bitterness. After wiping themselves, women often smelled like kitchens after closing time, their skin carrying notes of onions, fish, and stale broth. Neighbours noticed, but no one mocked. They understood that for those who had no water at home, even this foul mixture was precious. It is almost bleakly humorous to imagine someone wiping themselves proudly with liquid that smelled of stew and calling it clean. But such was the logic of the slums. Children learned to endure the process, too. Mothers pressed damp rags against their faces, wiping away dirt while leaving streaks of grease. The children squirmed but rarely resisted. They understood that it was better than nothing. Some even licked their lips afterward, tasting the saltiness of the dishwater, and shuddered. Yet they grew used to it, as they grew used to so many indignities of poverty. Over time, they came to associate the sharp, sour smell with attempts at care, confusing discomfort with cleanliness. Compared with modern habits, the difference is vast. Today, people expect water to flow freely from taps, hot and cold at will. Bathing is routine, often done daily, with soaps and lotions designed to leave skin fragrant. In contrast, the poor of Victorian London rubbed themselves with greasy dishwater, calling it hygiene. It would be like someone today walking into a fast food restaurant, scooping dirty mop water from the floor and using it as a body wash because nothing else was available. The thought is repellent, yet for them it was ordinary. The physical effects were harsh. Grease clogs pores, causing rashes and boils. Residual food particles stuck to skin and clothing, attracting insects. The faint traces of soap rather than cleansing often left dryness and irritation. Some women developed constant itching or sores that worsened over time. But they returned to the practice because it was the only option available. The discomfort of wiping with greasy water was preferable to the despair of doing nothing. Inside the small one-room dwellings, the ritual often took place at night. Women placed bowls of filtered dishwater near the hearth and began wiping themselves down after the day's labour. Family members looked away, not out of modesty but out of courtesy, pretending to grant privacy in a space that had none. The rag used for wiping was hung afterward to dry, stiffening with grease, only to be used again the following evening. Over time, the rags themselves carried the odour so strongly that even when dry they smelled of kitchens. For some, the water became more than just a tool for cleaning. It symbolised a tiny victory, proof that they had found a way to care for themselves despite poverty. They could face the next day believing they had not given up entirely. The illusions of cleanliness gave them a sense of dignity, however fragile. I cannot help but think how heavy it must have felt to cling to dignity through liquid most of us would recoil from touching. Communities recognised these practices without judgment. In neighbourhoods where sewage flowed openly in the streets and rats shared living spaces, the idea of using dishwater as hygiene seemed practical rather than shameful. Women exchanged tips on filtering methods, sometimes advising each other to let the water sit overnight so food particles would settle at the bottom. These small tricks gave them control in a world where little else was under their power. The broader society, however, condemned them. Reports from wealthier districts described the stench of the poor as evidence of laziness. Reformers wrote of greasy odours clinging to clothing, blaming women for not keeping themselves clean. Rarely did anyone acknowledge that the water they used came from taverns and kitchens, already dirty before it reached them. The condemnation was cruel, turning survival strategies into moral failings. Day after day, the cycle continued. Dishwater was collected, filtered, rubbed into skin, and reused until it evaporated or soured completely. The practice left marks on bodies and spirits alike. It revealed how far people would go to find even the illusion of cleanliness, how poverty reshaped the very meaning of hygiene. They dipped rags into greasy dishwater, wiped themselves down, and breathed in the sour smell that clung long after the act was done. To them, each drop was as valuable as perfume, because it offered the smallest hope of cleanliness in a filthy world, yet even this ritual could be stripped away further, reduced to wiping only the face with cloths too foul to wash. Mourning in the slums of Victorian London began with small rituals that tried to impose order on a world that was always unclean. Without water to rinse their mouths or basins to splash their faces, women reached for damp cloths that had been set aside the night before. These clothes were not fresh. They were stained from repeated use, their fibres stiff with mildew and discoloration. Yet they remained folded carefully, as though neatness could disguise filth. A corner was dipped into a little water if any was available, and then pressed to the lips, dragged across the chin, or wiped quickly over closed eyes. It was not a cleansing so much as a gesture, but the gesture mattered. The act carried a rhythm. Cloth touched the mouth first, then moved to the cheeks, finally across the brow. Each motion was deliberate, repeated day after day, as though routine itself gave meaning to the task. For women who had no access to soap or proper washing, this became a substitute for a morning rinse. The fabric was cool at first, carrying a brief shock to skin that had sweated through the night. That chill gave the impression of freshness, even as the cloth spread bacteria across the face. When the wiping was finished, women often touched their cheeks with their bare hands, smoothing the skin gently, comforting themselves with the thought that they had done what they could. It feels almost tragically amusing to picture someone patting their face proudly after wiping it with a mouldy cloth. But this was the only routine available. The clothes themselves told a story of neglect and persistence. Their colours faded from repeated dampening and drying, their surfaces spotted with green and red mildew, yet they were never thrown away. Each piece of fabric had value, and once assigned to this purpose, it remained until it disintegrated entirely. Families folded them carefully, storing them beside cooking pots or bedding ready for reuse. To keep them neat was to preserve some illusion of dignity. Cleanliness could not be achieved, but order could. Children watched and learned. They mimicked their mothers, dabbing at their mouths with corners of cloths, sometimes laughing at the odd taste of mildew that lingered on their lips. For them, this was normal. They grew into adults who accepted that wiping with a damp rag counted as washing. Girls inherited clothes passed down from older women, carrying stains that had accumulated over the years. The cycle continued, unquestioned, because there was no alternative. Modern comparisons highlight the distance between then and now. Today, morning routines often involve showers, fresh towels, and fragrant soaps. Even the poorest in many societies expect access to water for rinsing. To imagine starting the day by wiping the face with a rag used for a week straight, speckled with mould, is shocking. It would be like someone today reusing the same paper napkin for days to brush their teeth, convinced that the act alone counted as hygiene. The gulf between habit and health underscores how poverty reshaped the meaning of cleanliness. The physical effects were evident. Faces developed rashes where mildew touched the skin, eyes stung from spores carried into their corners, lips cracked under the rough fabric, split further by constant rubbing. Yet women endured these irritations. To appear as though they had made an effort mattered more than the consequences. A woman seen wiping her face in the morning was seen as someone who cared for herself, however little the gesture accomplished. The smell of the cloth lingered. A sour odour clung to cheeks and hands after wiping. Families ignored it, accustomed to stronger smells of coal smoke, sewage, and spoiled food. In such an environment, the odour of mildew barely registered. Outsiders, however, noticed. Visitors from wealthier districts recoiled at the sight and smell of women pressing mouldy cloths to their faces. Reformers described it in their reports, using it as proof of degeneration among the poor, but they rarely acknowledged that these habits were born from scarcity, not choice. Inside cramped homes, the ritual also carried a sense of privacy. Though space was limited, women tried to turn slightly away from others while wiping, as though embarrassed by the inadequacy of their method. Children peeked curiously, learning without words what it meant to begin the day. Husbands rarely commented. Silence protected dignity. Even when everyone knew the clothes were foul, there were small variations. Some women dampened the cloth with leftover tea instead of water, believing the tannins gave a cleansing effect. Others added drops of vinegar, enduring the sting in their eyes for the sake of imagined purity. These additions rarely helped, but they created a sense of innovation, a belief that they were doing something extra for their health. Each adjustment reflected creativity born from necessity. The psychological importance of the act cannot be overstated. Poverty stripped people of control over so much food, shelter, work, and even life expectancy. To have a morning routine, however small, gave a sense of stability. Folding the cloth, dipping it in water, wiping the face. These motions anchored the day. They made people feel less adrift, more human. I cannot help but think that this search for dignity, however fragile, reveals as much about strength as it does about deprivation. Still, the harm added up. Skin grew rougher, eyes weaker, and infection spread. Some women carried permanent marks on their cheeks from years of wiping with contaminated fabric. They bore these scars without complaint, considering them part of life. To them, health was not the absence of suffering, but the ability to keep moving through it. Reports from doctors occasionally mentioned skin diseases in the slums, though they were often dismissed as trivial. Officials cared more about cholera and typhus, threats that reached wealthier neighbourhoods. The quiet suffering of women wiping their faces with mouldy rags never became a matter of concern. Their struggles remained invisible, hidden in plain sight within the daily rhythms of poverty. They dipped cloths into water, dragged them across lips and eyes, and smoothed their faces with weary hands, convincing themselves they had washed. Mould grew, odours lingered, but the ritual continued as though it were sacred. And just as the face was tended with scraps, the feet bore their own crude care, scraped and cut by tools never meant for flesh. Feet in the slums of Victorian London carried the full weight of poverty. Women walked long distances on cobbled streets, through alleys filled with refuse, and across damp floors inside their cramped homes. Shoes, if they had any, were thin and quickly worn, offering little protection from the rough surfaces beneath. Over time, the skin on their heels thickened into hard layers that cracked and bled. Without money for proper tools, women turned to whatever objects lay around them to keep their feet from splitting apart. Stones from the hearth, still warm from fire, became substitutes for files, pressed hard against their heels. These stones scraped away the thickened layers of skin. The process was painful and crude, but it was the only form of foot care they could manage. The sound of scraping filled the rooms in the evenings. Women sat on low stools, pulling one foot across their lap, and pressed the rough stone against the calloused heel. Each motion tore at dry skin, sending white flakes scattering onto the floor. The skin beneath was raw and often tender, but the scraping continued until the heel felt smooth enough to walk without snagging against worn stockings. The relief was immediate but temporary, as the cracks returned within days. Still, the ritual persisted, part of the endless cycle of survival. It almost feels darkly comic to think of someone proudly admiring their bleeding heel as proof of cleanliness. Yet for them, it was a small victory. When stones were not available, Other objects were used. Metal bottle caps, often discarded in taverns or alleys, were pressed into service as crude blades. Women ran the jagged edges along their toenails, forcing them shorter when they became too painful inside shoes. The caps bent easily, slipping against the nail and cutting into skin. Blood followed, seeping across toes and staining cloths wrapped hastily around the wounds. The pain lingered long after, yet these makeshift tools continued to be used. The thought of going without was worse than the injuries they caused. The consequences were harsh. Open cuts created paths for infection, and in homes filled with dampness and dirt, wounds rarely healed cleanly. Toes swelled, heels cracked deeper, and infections spread up the legs. Some women limped for weeks, hiding their pain as they continued working. A few collapsed from fevers brought on by untreated wounds, but such outcomes were seen as inevitable rather than extraordinary. Medical help was almost never sought. Doctors charged fees far beyond reach, and hospitals were feared as places of death. Survival depended on enduring the pain rather than curing the cause. Modern habits make the contrast clear. Today, clippers, files, and ointments are easily purchased, and foot care is a matter of comfort rather than survival. Even those with limited means can find tools designed for safety. It is like imagining a person today trying to cut their toenails with the sharp edge of a soda can, believing it to be a normal part of life. The idea is grotesque, but for Victorian women in the slums, it was not imagination but necessity. The ritual extended into family life. Mothers scraped their daughters' feet with stones, pressing firmly despite the girls' protests. Tears flowed freely, but the work continued until the skin peeled away in strips. Sons, too, had their nails hacked down with metal fragments before heading to factories. Fathers sometimes helped, though more often they simply watched, their own feet covered in calluses they ignored. The practice passed from one generation to the next, each child growing accustomed to the sight of blood mingled with the dust of scraped skin on the floor. The smell of iron from wounds mixed with the constant scent of smoke and dampness. Homes grew heavy with it during the evenings when several family members tended to their feet at once. Cloths used to stop the bleeding were set aside to dry, stiffening into stiff patches of red and brown. These cloths were reused until they fell apart, wrapped again and again around new cuts. The cycle of injury and makeshift healing became part of the texture of life, accepted without question. The practice also carried shame. Women hid their feet whenever possible, even among neighbours who lived in similar conditions. They covered heels with stockings patched many times, embarrassed by the cracks and sores beneath. Yet in private they returned to scraping, compelled by the need to walk without pain. Pride in appearance warred with the humiliation of exposure, a contradiction that marked so many aspects of slum life. I cannot help but think that hiding such suffering, while enduring it daily, reveals a quiet strength that went unrecognised. Reformers who entered the slums occasionally noted the condition of feet, describing them as ruined or neglected. They rarely understood the improvisation behind the wounds. To them, the injuries were evidence of carelessness. To the women themselves, they were evidence of effort. Better to scrape until bleeding than to allow feet to crack so deeply that walking becomes impossible. The logic of desperation did not fit into the tidy judgments of those who never had to choose between pain and mobility. Evenings ended with exhaustion. Women wiped their feet, wrapped cloths around fresh wounds, and tucked themselves into straw bedding. The pain kept them awake, but at least they knew they had done something. By morning, the wounds had dried enough to allow walking, and another day of labour began. The process repeated endlessly, as constant as breathing. Another hidden struggle carried silently within the walls of the slums. They pressed stones to their heels and bottle caps to their nails, drawing blood in the name of hygiene, then wrapped the wounds in dirty cloths before resting for another day of labour. The cycle of injury and survival became ordinary, a rhythm no one questioned. Yet there were some who chose to stop fighting altogether, letting their bodies go untouched, rendering even the appearance of care. In the slums of Victorian London, survival often